Okay, so here we go. We are going to learn how to calculate target heart rate zones for training. Okay, and so I'm going to walk you through these steps of exactly how to do it. So we're going to use me as an example. Okay, so I am the example. I'll put in all my information so that we can figure out what heart rate I should be looking for. Okay, so here we go. We'll start with this formula. You should always be able to find the formula. So 220 minus my age is 30. So that means my maximum heart rate should be 190. 190 what? 190 apples, 190 millimeters of mercury. No, heart rate is always measured in beats per minute. So always keep that in mind. So 190 beats per minute. Then what we're going to do is we're going to calculate my exercise heart rate. And this is more the Karvonen method part of it that I was talking about. And this takes into account a person's fitness level. So how to do this is I'm going to find out my resting heart rate. And how I can do that, I'm going to use my wrist and my two fingers to calculate my resting heart rate. Could also use my neck. There's several other places, but those are the most common. So I'm going to calculate that and then I will tell you the answer. Okay, so I measured my resting heart rate and it was 60. So we're going to take our answer from the last question. We're taking our max heart rate, the 190, and then we're going to minus it by 60. And when you're getting someone's resting heart rate, it should always be measured in beats per minute. So you're measuring for a full minute long, or you could measure for 30 seconds and multiply by 2, or 15 seconds and multiply by 4. It's up to you. All right, so 190 minus 60 gives us 130. 130 what? Beats per minute. Gotta put it on there. It's important. Okay, now this next question, we're going to have to dig for a little more information. So now we're going to look at the training intensity. And so this example has 70% to 100%. That's just an example. So let's look back to what we were looking at in the PowerPoint. Right, you see here the training pyramid. Those are the zones we're talking about. So let's, for this example, pretend that I want to work on my lactate threshold training zone. So that means we look on the side of the pyramid that my exercise needs to be between 85 and 89% of my heart rate max, okay? So remember that 85 to 89%. Okay, so we're going to make this number 85 to 89%, and that's because we're working on our lactate threshold zone. Now, if I was wanting to work on my aerobic foundation, I would pick different numbers. It would be that 80 to 84. So it just depends on what area you are trying to train, okay? So let's calculate this out. Now, I take my exercise heart rate, just calculated that up here, correct? So I take 130 and I multiply it by my lactate threshold zone. So should I do 85% to 89%? No, that's a non-calculatable, all right? So we're going to split this into two parts, okay? So we're going to calculate the lower end, the 85%, and then we'll do a second calculation with the 89%, that higher end. So we'll multiply by 85%. 130 by 85%, and what will that give us? Okay, so I pulled in my calculator here for us to look at. So 130, I'm going to clear this out, 130 times 85%. Do I type in 85? No, think back to your high school math. When we're talking about percentages, we need to use the decimal, right? So a percentage is actually 130 times 0.85. Correct? That's 85%. That gives us 110.5 what? Beats per minute. Okay? Now, if we had done 130 times 85, that would have given us a crazy number. When we see really big numbers like this, that is incorrect. You should instinctively say, something went wrong, because that's just not a logically acceptable number. Okay? So now that we've done this, This gives us our lower end. That's that 85%. Now, we're going to do almost the exact same thing, but all we're going to do is change from 85% to what's the higher end of the zone? 89%. So we're doing the exact same calculations. So 130 times the 89%, and that gives us 115.7. All right, 115.7. Okay, so this is kind of an easy way to get the two lower ends and the higher ends. So now we have an exercise heart rate that would be at 85% and an exercise heart rate that would be at 89%. Now we need to add back in our resting heart rate, that original resting heart rate that I figured out, that 60 beats per minute that I calculated by measuring for a full minute. We need to add that back in because that is part of our regular heart rate. So we're going to take these numbers, or so we don't need all those numbers, we just need to take the 110, which is the 85%, and the 115, which is the 89%, and to both of these, we are going to add back in our resting heart rate, which is 60 beats per minute. So 110.5 plus 60 is 170.5 what? Beats per minute. You're not going to forget that. All right, then at the higher end, 115 plus 60 beats per minute, that will give us 175.7 beats per minute to give us that total calculation, okay? So now we've calculated this really great information. So now we can say all of this kind of walks you through the same thing if you were to write it out individually. But this is going to give you your training target heart rate. Okay, so now we know that if I want to work on my lactate threshold, then that means I need to be at 170.5 all the way up to 175.7 beats per minute. Okay, so this is when I'm exercising, I can measure it and see, am I in the right zone? Am I really working on my lactate threshold? And if my heart rate isn't ending up between this 170.5 and 175.7, that means I am not training my lactate threshold. That means I'm in a different level of this pyramid. If it's above it, maybe I'm working on my anaerobic training or my speed training. If I'm below it, that means I'm working on my aerobic foundation. So I am not in that lactate threshold training zone. So you want to make sure that your athletes are training in the zone that you actually want them to be in at the time. So it kind of depends what area, what sport you're in, what time of year it is, how far along you are in the season, what zone of that pyramid you want them to be in. But this gives you great information, and the beautiful part is this information used to be kind of hard to utilize, but now we have so many smart devices that can help us do this type of training better. So Apple Watches, smart watches, many running watches that are much less expensive than those really high-priced Apple Watches can even calculate heart rate. They're not the world's best at calculating heart rate, but they are fairly accurate.